Thank you to Critical Path to bring us all together. As Jan said in his introduction, it's extremely important that all the different stakeholders talk to each other and collaborate on this. And I really talk from experience. It's too huge a task to tackle all by yourself, especially if you're in the industry. I would like to talk about the industry's perspective on drug development for tuberculosis, and most specifically, in our case, MDR, so multi-drug resistant TB drug development. Most of the issues have already been tackled, addressed to a certain extent, so I probably will not use all of my 20 minutes. But I will go over them as you see them listed here. There are, of course, financial constraints, especially if the target population of patients is in areas of the world that have economical challenges. Clinical trial design and execution, that has been addressed already. Regulatory challenges, we have been talking about that. And then afterwards, and I'm glad that it has also been brought under the in this meeting, rather, that it doesn't stop licensing, getting licensure for a drug, but also how the drug is made accessible, but also to secure appropriate use is a concern of us. And then I will briefly talk about where are the opportunities, has progress been made, and what could be potential incentives. We've heard a number of them already mentioned, and I would very briefly touch upon other potential incentives as well. Here I've listed in somewhat more detail the challenges. And if we talk about clinical trial-related challenges, as I mentioned, and specifically for multi-drug resistant TB, the high-burden countries are usually those countries who don't have the infrastructure to perform clinical studies up to standard. So there is a need for capacity building, and we need help there too. It is very difficult as it is to develop a drug, but if you have to develop the infrastructure at the same time, it costs a lot of money and time. There is also the limitations of lab capacity, and therefore the coordination of doing reliable testing of your surrogate endpoint is an important factor. The impact in general of the long-term TB efficacy trials is, of course, directly felt in terms of cost. And then we have already addressed it, surrogate markers, when we were conducting the studies, and I will briefly give an overview of them, very short in one slide. We used, of course, the surrogate marker suggested and already discussed earlier this morning, but the validation, as was also addressed earlier this morning, still has to come. And then when we saw the first slide of this meeting today, the new paradigm of studying different regimens or different components in one new regimen at the same time is extremely important. When we were conducting our trials, that opportunity didn't exist, so we had to add on the new compound to the standard of care. And hopefully in phase 3 we will be able to do that slightly differently and not using the standard of care but a modified treatment. Regulatory hurdles, we have talked about them. Clinical trial approval timelines, that is very important. It's not necessarily in the well-regulated countries, but as I pointed out, patients are in countries where that regulatory framework is not as worked out well. Lack of regulatory harmonization or first track for public health related solutions. And then, as I already pointed out, a need to address single agent approval processes in our case, and the long regulatory timelines and expense that come with it. Then a very important one, and I understand that it hasn't been discussed at this meeting, but the lack of commercial incentives. We have to realize that, especially in the population that we are seeking a license for, the return on investment is just not there. So we have to find other means to fund or co-fund the development, or to make it a lot more efficient than what we usually do. So the lack of commercial incentives limits drug development and drug discovery, especially also since development is more costly. And I alluded to that when I'm talking about the infrastructure or the capacity that needs to be built, which is different from a typical drug development situation. And then afterwards, especially for MDR-TB, the limited scale of manufacturing, which of course has an impact on the cost of goods. And then the fourth one, bottom left, a very important one, as I mentioned. In a very regulated environment, you usually don't have to worry that much about appropriate use of the drug. Well, we are talking, and again, I'm referring to MDR-TB, pre-XDR-TB situation, that the adoption is a very important one. It doesn't end at the time of licensing. There has to be a period of time in which WHO has an important role to play for treatment guidelines and the appropriate use of the new developed drug. The role of the essential medicines list, pre-qualification process, and then every country has a national TB program, and also there, of course, discussions, negotiations need to happen. All of that before the drug can actually be brought onto the market and access given to patients. To highlight this based on the example we had with bedaquiline, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but as you can see, it's a long development timeline even for a lean program. The clinical development, as you can see, started well before 2004 and will continue till the end of 2013. Phase 1 trials, 11 in total we have done, are continuing. And then the phase 2, you see that the program is based on a trial, an EBA trial that was done in 2005, 75 patients, then followed by 2 phase 2 studies. A phase 2 study that was with a staged approach, a first stage of about 47 patients, then moved into a larger study, placebo-controlled study, blinded in about 160 MDR-TB patients, and then alongside second phase 3 trial with 230 plus patients, both MDR-TB, pre-XDR, and some even XDR, was started. It's an open study to provide more safety information. End of this year, we will start the phase 3 study, as you can see. More than 600 patients in pre-XDR TB. Challenging geography, I already talked about that. The high burden countries for MDR, pre-XDR TB are mainly India, China, and Russia. That covers more than half of the total cases. There are constraints associated there, of course, and as I talked about, the trial capacity and the burden to work on that alongside the development of the drug. So if you look at the balance then, costs are high, and I would say that probably higher than any other typical development. You have the discovery, the development, the post-approval commitments, and the cost to launch and to secure appropriate use of the drug. And that should be offset by the returns in sales and incentives. Well, as I already said, in this particular indication, the return on investment will definitely not offset the cost, which makes it, of course, a difficult model for the industry to continue. Challenging geography also leads to a difference in regulatory timelines. In many of the countries, high-burden countries, we don't have infrastructure ourselves, company infrastructure, which already makes it a more challenging situation to be in. It's not only the US and European regulatory timelines, it's also discussions that follow after licensing on pricing, reimbursement, and then on top of that, regulatory timelines in parts of the world where the path is far less clear and consistent. Ensuring appropriate use after the drug is licensed, especially for drugs that are used only in a limited number of treatments compared to other treatments that are needed in the developing world. It is a challenge to be sure that there is a constant and consistent access possible to the drugs. And we will be talking and are talking to organizations who can help us doing that. So what progress have we made? And you already heard it this morning. We have submitted both in the US and in Europe our file. So based on the accelerated approval scheme, and we'll have here in the US an advisory committee in November. How did we make it work? When I said that return on investment is not in balance with the investment that has to be made and the difficulties, I think it's only possible to do that in an environment where there is a strong belief that it is part of our mission to supply drugs or to make medicines accessible to patients also in developing countries. And as I said, it's not just developing the drug. There is more that comes into play here. Access issues in developing countries are very complex as you see them listed. So it's not just to develop the drug, to get licensed and make it available. There is lack of infrastructure, and we take it also to our heart to work on that. Education, funding, training for of the medical professionals, and there has to be, of course, local government commitment and interactions, and a relationship needs to be built with the local government. We are committed to do that, and we have done that for our HIV products, and also have the intention to do that with bedaquiline for MDR-TB. And we do that using different mechanism or channels, as you can see them listed. Voluntary license is one. We have done that with our HIV products. Broad access programs, which guarantee that the drug will be made available at a price that is in balance with the developing economies of the countries in some of the high-burden countries. We have early access programs already in place, and then finally, the product donation programs. What could ease the burden? This is my last slide. It's not a surprise that the financial issues are listed here on top. As I explained, innovative financing mechanisms, and we could learn perhaps from the vaccine world, where advanced market commitments are made. Regulatory harmonization and mutual recognition would be very helpful to reduce the burden of getting the drug approved in those different countries through individual regulatory interactions and reviews. And then the last one, to ease the development path, validated surrogate markers, not only for phase 2, but even for phase 3. But we heard earlier today that we are making progress there as well. This was my last slide. Thank you for your attention.